Alrighty, day number 5, coming back to the GHD. Really like this one as you get that full extension in the core. Remember, you can always do a like a hyper-extended sit-up on like a med ball, going through these to supplement in that little further extension, or even a stability ball. Honestly, even a bench works really well too. Something that's placed underneath your hips and your low back, so you're getting that full stretch, so the floor is not stopping your range of motion. I got my buddy Aaron here today. He's my training partner to go through this one with me. So as you're going through the 2 to 3 rounds, this one is very dependent on your volume and how intense you want to move onto it. So depending on your skill level, toes to bar is a very challenging movement. We decided to move into a more strict toe to bar version today rather than the more kipping variety. You can always use a kip knee raise, kip hanging leg raise, even a kipping toes to bar for a little bit easier. So we opt for a little bit harder here on this one. And then the 20 GHD sit-ups. We just did 2 rounds today working through. So remember, the goal is just kind of up the volume as you're rolling through each one of these. And then today worked on the Russian kettlebell swings, where you have a 55-pound kettlebell for us today, working through those sets of 20 unbroken. So that we were working on that low back and stretching out the glutes, hamstrings, and even that low back, even all the way through those spinal erectors. Those are all connected with the core movements rolling through. It is really a big difference on these toe to bars. You can see trying to keep the legs straight and the feet close together rather than trying to come up at one at a time, or the knees bending and then scooping through. Those are all different varieties to kind of modify and make things easier as you're going through. So as you go through these, really try and make this much more of a hip hinge movement. Kettlebell swings are not meant to be a squat, especially with the way that we're doing it and putting it into the core program. The goal is to really try and light up everything through the core, hips, obliques, low back. All those things are interconnected through the core and abs. So it is apparent to try and balance everything out, front, back, and side to side, even those rotational movements working in that transverse plane as you roll through. Notice how Aaron here, he is doing a little bit of a kip. I had a little bit of a swing in mine as well. So it just depends on where your skill level is at that day and how your core is feeling, how fatigued it is going through, and he opted to break his up as we roll through. So coming in around number 2, same concept, really focusing on more quality, especially today. Today's a little bit longer circuit with the 15-minute EMOM after this. So as you're going through, make sure you kind of pace it out as such. The goal is to get this done right about 20-ish minutes. We were a little bit over today with the 2 rounds, so you can kind of time it and see how fast you can get through everything as you roll through. Aaron opts for a little bit more bent arm swing here, but notice how he still is hinging at the hips. Same premise, all the power is coming from the hips. He's just keeping a little bit looser elbow than a tight frame. So this is a very common style that you will see rolling through, so that option is up to you on how you want to hit those kettlebell swings. Coming in that second and third potentially round for some of us rolling through. So depending on the weight, like I say, and how intense your things are, maybe you're opting for smaller sets and a little bit more volume. Otherwise, we're going for a little bit more intensity. Remember, like I said on the other day when we were working on our heavy weighted sit-ups, the goal for abs is actually to kind of up the weight, just like you would do with any movement, squat, bench press, things like that, so that you actually build a little bit more mass and depth in your core rather than just high volume. So if you know that you're hitting high volume on, say today, like that EMOM that is coming up, today would be a great day to kind of push the intensity in each one of those specific movements. So opting for a little bit more of a stricter kip, a little less swing, opting for a little bit higher toes towards the bar, a little bit higher knee to chest. You can even add weight to these. Sometimes people like to add ankle weights, maybe put a med ball and or dumbbell in between the feet, heavier shoe. Honestly, there's a lot of different options here to kind of work through those. So we'll kind of skip ahead here, fast forward in getting into that EMOM as Aaron and I finish up our second round. All right, coming into this EMOM. So I was kind of practicing a couple movements here. First one we're going to do is start off with that hollow rock position. Notice how you always want to keep a nice tight arch. It should be a very smooth rock, front to back, side to side. Feet tight together. The higher your hands are overhead, the more you're going to feel that in the upper core. Really trying to squeeze through the ankles, extending the arms, toes, legs. You can always bend the knees, tighten up that ball a little bit. and that way it makes it a little bit easier. As you see us go through it, we certainly hit our fatigue point working through these. You'll see a couple different modifications that we both use for these hollow rock varieties. Tucking into that ball tighter, shorten up the legs, makes things a little bit easier on the lower core as you're warming through. So I try and hit this first round unbroken. This is a very volume heavy set, going through 15 minutes. Really, you have a couple minutes of rest in there at the end of each round, but this is going to severely tax the endurance of the core, getting away from those bigger muscles, starting to hit those lower muscles, the smaller ones that aren't used as much going through, especially in this alternating crunch. I like to keep the feet elevated, really try and get that big squeeze, pulling the elbow to the knee rather than pulling the knees to elbows. A lot of time in those crunches and or bicycles, you'll see the legs move much more than the upper body. Today is one of those days where you really want to try and get that upper body to move much more than the lower body. There are plenty of the lower body movements coming up later. Hollow rocks is much more of a static hold position. The toes to bar was one of those, especially even the GHDs. There's a lot of tension that comes through the quads and the hip flexors going through those movements. So there's a reason why we're trying to target different movements and different motions so that you work all the core muscles the whole time. Really only took us about a minute, 90 seconds to really kind of feel this whole workout and how it was going to add up and build together. So you'll feel this one immediately and try and maintain that pump and that burn in that core. After this is called a boat hold or a V-up hold. Immediately, you're kind of starting off with legs nice and straight. You want to try and keep that V as tight as possible. You can always grab onto the legs, as you'll see us do here, to try and keep the feet up. You notice how I'm already grabbing on as well. Trying to keep that tight position, then the knees bent, and then dropping the feet down as you work through. So the goal would be to try and spend as much time with your hands off your legs as possible and balancing only on the glutes, not on the low back. So notice how I pick my hands up for here. This is one of those movements that's very difficult. You're already talking about 2.5 minutes into a straight ab workout, plus the buy-in, warm-up kind of core movement that we added for volume at the beginning. So this one's going to be a very fatiguing movement, working through holding that tight compression in gymnastics is what it's called, trying to pull the knees and chest tight together and hold under movements as you work through. So after that boat hold, next up is a little lateral scissor kicks, lateral side-to-side leg splits. We've all done these before, trying to drive that lower back into the floor. Sometimes I like to think about it as the belly button to the spine, holding that tight so you're hitting that, keeping that lower core engaged and that pelvic floor tight. So now we're working on that side-to-side movement. We've had the scissor kicks, we've had the movements like that, but these are meant to target the smaller muscle groups that we don't use on a daily basis and continually in our regular training. All right, rounding out the last 10 seconds, and you have that 1 minute recovery. Especially with a high volume workout such as this, getting recovery time where you actually get time to relax the core and the hip flexors is really, really big. No, both of us will most likely stay pretty extended in this position. Maybe a couple press-ups go on, trying to relax the core. So that way we're not keeping tension on the hip flexors and the lower abs continuously, even as you rest. So getting that recovery time, even standing, walking around, that's a good way and a big way to kind of stretch out and move. Sitting down, keeping those hips flexed constantly, that is something that is difficult. You see both of us kind of sitting back on our heels like this. This is actually giving a little bit of a quad stretch, which stretches out the lower part of those hip flexors, which attaches to the lower core muscles. So it's another way to kind of stretch out and relax, elongate those muscle groups in there coming into that second round and especially going into that third round. So getting ready to go back to that hollow rock again. Goal is big sets today as we're rolling through. So 1 minute hollow rock hold, coming up in 2, 1, we'll pick that feet up nice and long, keeping the legs pointed, toes together, tight, arms and legs extended. Notice how Aaron is going to that more of that ball rock because his core is falling apart. I say falling apart, but it's getting more tired, more fatigued, and that's perfectly fine. Then he extends back out when he's ready and right back into it, but he's still getting extra reps going through. That will be pretty typical for most of us. I even know that I bend my knees and I start tucking a little bit towards the end as well. So still getting the rep, getting that time under tension when you can, and trying to stay with that rock as much as possible. That's just going to build that core. So maybe if this time you did 5 seconds of hollow rocks, then you tucked in tight, and then you know that that's how you worked for your minute. When you get back into that same concept, you'll be like, okay, next time I'll try and add 1 or 2 seconds, and then you stay in that ball. That way you constantly build and kind of add to that core strength going through, especially through the second set, and then trying to get into 3. Going back into those alternating crunches. One thing that is kind of hard to see too, because Aaron's there, is that 30 seconds I'll keep one leg crossed, and then at the halfway mark I'll cross the other way. So that way you're still building uniformity unilaterally side to side, so you're getting the left and right leg. There is a little bit of tension. It's not a lot, but when you do cross your legs, that is something that kind of adds up over time, especially across a bunch of reps when you're talking about 15 minutes. All right, the second set on this boat hold. This is very, very challenging. Notice how the knees start to flare out on myself. I'm starting to bend the knees a little bit more. Still try and get into it. This is a pretty good one to really tax a lot of those little core movements going through. So this is probably the one that's most likely going to fall apart first, because it's a static hold and not anything dynamic. So you don't get a point in time where something relaxes in the body. And remember, it's always perfectly acceptable to get a little rest time. This is built on you and trying to challenge yourself. So play games with yourself. Maybe you do like 5 or 10 seconds, 2 or 3 seconds off, 5 or 10 seconds, 2 or 3 seconds off. Try and find what works best for you, so it's difficult and challenging, not something that is too long a recovery time. Because you talk about a minute, yes, that's a long time in terms of like a cardio movement or a lot of reps. But if you're resting 10, 15 seconds at a time, and you do that twice across the minute, all of a sudden you almost have half your time gone. So trying to minimize that rest time, push yourself through the minute, move on to that next core and the next muscle movement and group, so that you are getting a different muscle taxed each time. So you only got to survive that 60 seconds, and then you're going right back into something else, and you get a little bit different burn effect. So mentally, it's kind of a break when you change movements, which is really nice. But then again, it is just enough challenge about 30, 40 seconds in where you really start to feel it. Everything gets really tired and weak. But then you just have to think about, well, I just got a couple seconds left, and you just got to fight through it. So it's the main point of these EMOMs, is to just get as much work in as possible, change the muscle group, and get right back into it. So finishing our second set, letting those legs relax, and then we'll go into round number 3. I'll speed it up a little bit because you guys have seen it. Don't want to waste too much of your time. So good work. Day number 5 is complete. I'll see you guys for day number 6.